Hello, everyone. Welcome to the NJEP webinar, Aligning School Start Times for Adolescent Health, the case for starting school later. My name is Marcella Betzer, and I'm a program director with the New Jersey chapter, American Academy Pediatrics. For the last several years, NJEP has spearheaded a task force on adolescent sleep and school start times. The task force, led by our chair, Dr. Bert Mandelbaum, has conducted various educational activities to spread awareness about this issue throughout New Jersey, involving stakeholders from local districts in this process, as well as representatives from the state's school-focused organizations. Before we get started, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar will last 1 hour, and all attendees will be muted throughout the webinar in order to minimize any disruptions to the presenters. If you have questions related to today's presentation, you can submit them through the Q&A box on the webinar control panel, located at the top or bottom of your screen. And any questions remaining unanswered at the end of the webinar will be compiled and the answers provided to participants a few days following the webinar. We are recording the webinar and it'll be made available on the NJEP website later this week. I want to welcome our two presenters. Dr. Bert Mandelbaum is a pediatrician at Princeton Nassau Pediatrics, a school physician for multiple districts and the chair of the Department of Pediatrics at Penn Medicine Princeton Health. He also serves as the chair for the NJEP's Task Force on Adolescent Sleep and School Start Times and is on the Sports Medicine Advisory Committee for the NJSIAA. Dr. Steinbaum is a primary care pediatrician and school physician in northern New Jersey, whose focus is on improving mental health in primary care. She is board certified in general pediatrics and child abuse pediatrics, serves on the NJEP Task Force on Adolescent Sleep and School Start Times, and leads the Ridgewood, New Jersey chapter of Start School Later. Now, without further delay, it's my pleasure to turn the webinar over to Dr. Mandelbaum.
Thank you, Marcella, and Dr. Steinbaum, thank you for joining me on this talk. And thanks to everyone who is tuning in. We will try to be respectful of time, and we will try to finish this talk right around 1:15 or so, 1:20 at the latest, just so we can answer any questions. Often there are questions that come up, but our hope is that the talk will address a lot of the common questions, because as we've had these discussions, similar concerns come up, so we'll walk you through it. This is what Marcella had talked about. This is myself, and this is Dr. Steinbaum, and we've been doing this for a while, giving talks to different audiences over time, and we're really excited to be here today. All right, so Deb, our goal for today, we're going to try to do 3 general things. So the first one is, for this audience, we're going to try to bring just general awareness of what the importance of sleep is, specifically in teens. Occasionally when we talk, we'll talk about younger kids as well, and but we're going to really try to drive home the point of why sleep is so important. And then the second aspect of this is we're going to try to make that connection to show you that one of the main factors specifically for our teenagers are that they are not getting enough sleep because of the way that we construct the school day, specifically when we start schools. And we're hoping to give you this evidence so that we can kind of motivate you to take next steps.
And this is Deb Steinbaum. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. I just wanted to jump in and say, throughout the course of this, I'll be hopping in and out to just provide some running commentary on things as Bert speaks. So if you hear me jump in, that is why. Yeah,
Deb's going to be my color commentator. There really are 2 parts to this talk when we do it. Deb and I, what we focused on for years are, as the physicians, were the science behind it, why we should be doing this. And what we found is that often it's pretty easy to convince people about what the science is. The science is really straightforward. There's a ton of evidence. We'll walk you through that. But then the second portion of this is often the how, and people get stuck in, how would you do it? There are a lot of perceived obstacles that are much more surmountable than people realize. So we'll touch on those, but that is really going to be left for a second portion of this series that we're hoping to do later in September, at which point our goal is to have administrators who have done this, actually made the move talk about it and focus on how they did it, and answer common questions for you. So we're going to spend most of our time on the why. So it starts with, why are schools the way they are right now? And so the first portion of this is understanding that there is not anyone in education who consciously made the decision that teenagers will learn better if we drag them up and get them to school at 7 a.m. Like, that was not the goal of any of this. And it really was something that started in the late 80s. So if you look back in the 1950s or 60s and beyond, before that, schools were always starting at 9 a.m., maybe 8:30, but you had one school and one school start time. And it really became a population/transportation issue. As towns got bigger, you ended up having more students, and you couldn't get everyone to school at the same time. And so they started to say, well, what if we use the same buses and bus drivers, and we'll run 2 routes? And then depending on where you are, I know in many suburbs throughout New Jersey, and if people are listening from other portions of the state, portions of the country, there's 3 tiers, right? And what they ended up doing is moving the teenagers to the earlier tier. And Deb, do you have high school kids now?
I do. And it's
What
brutal.
time? What time do they go to school?
Their school begins at 7:45. I will tell you that when I went to high school in the 80s, we started at 7:39 a.m. It's drummed into my brain. But when I've asked my parents about this, they started at 9 from their recollection, and maybe it was later when I've talked to them. And I think it's important for all of us to talk to kind of our older relatives, friends, see what their experience was, because as I spoke with my parents about it, their comment was, wow, I never thought about that. Oh yeah, how do they go to school so early? How do you do it? So
Well,
it's really eye-opening.
and I'm glad you said that, and I wanted to bring this up because I also have 2 teens in high school. I went to high school in the late 80s, and my high school also started at 7:20. And I think as whether it's physicians or educators or administrators, when you're talking to parents whose kids are going to school now, they remember doing the same thing. And so it seems normal, where if you go back one more generation, that was not the case. So the fact that parents went to school in the 80s at this time, that was not historically how it was, and that there is no educational benefit. No one is making an argument getting them to school earlier is better for them. So that's the first major issue. The second issue, and this is something that Deb and I deal with a lot, is as we're taking care of teenagers, though they might look like adults, they are not adults. Their brains are developing, and it is actually a critical time period for brain growth. So infancy is this huge time of brain growth. Everyone knows that, but adolescence, you could see on imaging studies, this is the second most critical time for brain growth throughout childhood. And and there are a lot of differences in the way adolescents' brains work. And as they are sleep deprived, they end up making much poorer decisions. So it will go through and show you how it impacts everything. But one of the misconceptions, and Deb, you might see this in your patients, when they looking at a teen and thinking that they are an adult, and a parent saying, well, I do this, why doesn't my teen do this? We know that their brains are different. They are just not wired the same yet. And then the third issue is mental health. And so it is hard to not be aware of the increasing struggles of mental health issues across the gamut, I think, in our population these days, but specifically for kids and focusing on teenagers. And we have seen data on this, and we've seen local data. I have my own ER data, and we have national data. So we know that suicide attempts have doubled from 08 to 17. That was pre-pandemic. When I looked at my data from our own local hospital from 2018, it almost doubled compared to 2015 and almost tripled from 2008. And then we know kind of post-pandemic, we've had a 30% increase from where it was in 2019, which was already really elevated. So I imagine, Deb, your day is now becoming a lot of
Anecdotally, there's a lot of hand-wringing going on right now about the mental health crisis that our our kids are facing, and I'm sure most of you are well aware of this, it has been steadily creeping up throughout probably the last 15 to 20 years. So this isn't something that was caused by the early start times, because those preceded, but the early start times are a significant contributor to it. And one of the few things that we actually have control over and can change. And historically, it's interesting. I started practicing in New Jersey around 10 to 15 years ago. When I first came here and spoke with people about sleep, there was a lot of pushback on, well, how are we going to possibly move start times earlier? We couldn't do that. There's not. Kids have to have their sports. They have to do this. And now when I talk to people, there's a much broader awareness of the issues related to lack of sleep and school start times. And I rarely in my office get any pushback from parents. Parents really are very supportive of this, despite the loud people on social media or the loud people at school board meetings. The vast majority of people understand what we're saying intuitively, even if they aren't able to parse out the data. And the mental health crisis, I think, is part of what's lending an urgency to this right now.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that was very well said. When we're going to show you data on how sleep impacts mental health in teens. And so again, we're not saying that the crisis is created by school start times. We're saying as a public health issue, this is one huge tool that we could use to kind of benefit every student and try to hopefully kind of stem the tide and help their mental health a bit. All right, so why is sleep so important? The last 5 to 10 years, the amount of sleep research that's come out really kind of focusing on the critical nature of sleep, about what it does in terms of, restoring health. It is where, your brain is really, really active, and it is taking, whether it's education or memories or kind of, there was an article I read this morning on motor planning. And so sleep is, your brain is really active during sleep. Teens need a decent amount of sleep. We think 9 to 9.25 hours. 8 hours seems to be a tipping point. And our average students, when we are typically getting 6 to 6.25 hours, some as little as 5 hours of sleep. And we'll walk you through why that is. But here's the rub. We know two things. When they don't get enough sleep, we know that it negatively impacts everything. You tell me something you care about, I will show you that not getting enough sleep negatively impacts this. We know that it negatively impacts learning. There are studies that look at retention so 5 to 6 hours of sleep versus 9 hours of sleep, and long-term retention, which is not a surprise, is much better with 9 hours of sleep versus 5. And that is the whole point of learning. We'll show you the mental health studies, but we know that lack of sleep increases the risk of depression, increases the risk of suicidality. We know that it impacts safety. There are studies that show changing school start times, thereby getting kids more sleep, decreases the rates of automobile accidents, which is one of the major causes of actual mortality in teenagers. Unfortunately, throughout the state of New Jersey in the last 5 years, there have been accidents on the way to school with principals and superintendents passing away, that have been involved in that from a teenage driver. We know from a physical health perspective, we know that lack of sleep increases the risk of obesity. There's some great information on lack of sleep and heart disease. So Matt Walker does a TED Talk. I think we'll show you a slide of this, talking about the increase of heart disease in the 24 hours after kind of leaping forward and losing an hour of sleep. And we know it impacts growth. We know it impacts increases your risk of impulsive behaviors, including their studies will show you substance abuse and sexual risk taking. And for those of you who care about sports, which a lot of us do, lack of sleep really increases the risk of sport injuries. And then
I'm going to jump in for a second here. For any of you who are New York Times readers, July 10th of this year, there was an article on the cover of the New York Times Magazine about chronobiology, which is the biology of time and of sleep. And there was a huge amount of information on how medicine is changing as we understand how time variation and variation with sleep actually affects things like immunology and inflammation and the time that we should take medications. Even something as simple as immunizations typically are more effective when given in the morning versus the afternoon. Some things that sound very basic, but are not well known. People who get 6 hours of sleep or less actually have distortion of their genetic material, and genes that regulate immunology are downregulated. So there's less immune function. Genes that regulate inflammation are upregulated. That can include things like cortisol, which is a stress hormone. And when we think about teens and stress and mental health, it fits right into that pathway, right? Because we think about inflammation and we have this surge of stress hormones and boom, our kids are stressed and this adds to it. And that is partly from just being tired, but also partly there's genetic involvement too, which is amazing.
Yeah, that's incredible. And if you flip that around and you get enough sleep, you actually see the opposite. Right. So we can see the reversal of all the negative impacts, and we can actually measure the positive impacts. So, and from a school perspective, we can measure that there is better attendance, better grades, better mood, self-reported by the adolescents. We can actually measure improved sports performance. And that is what we want. I mean, this is why it becomes such a critical public health issue when we have something that has such a negative impact as a consequence when you don't do it enough, and the reverse is true, and we can make policy changes. And that is, I think, why we're so passionate about this topic.
And also, it's not just increased sleep, it's actually adequate sleep. So we're not saying everybody needs to sleep 12 hours a night, which is what we see on some of our weekends with teenagers, which is something we'll discuss. But it really is adequate sleep supports those things. So if kids are getting somewhere in that 8.5 to 9.5 hour range, that's when we see that payoff for the most part. Another really interesting benefit of sleep that people like but don't talk about is there have actually been studies that show when school is started later at an appropriate time, parents and kids get along better. People report their relationships are greatly improved. And as a parent of a teen, I can tell you, waking up my kids every morning by yelling and going upstairs and yelling again, it's not a good thing for anybody.
And anything that could help my relationship with my two teens, I would take. So. And I think so that's a great springboard to get into this slide, because like you said, it's adequate sleep, and it's not just quantity, but it's the quality of sleep. So let's just go through it. So first, let me clarify. There's a lot of reasons you don't get enough quantity of sleep, right? So it's like, what time do you go to bed? What time do you wake up? And there are a bunch of things that are going through your mind about why are kids not going to sleep early. And there are absolutely a ton of kind of societal issues that make kind of enable them, encourage them to stay up later, right? And whether it's what we do at school, and so the homework that they get, or the amount of AP classes that they're taking, or whether it's their activities or sports, and they're in this many clubs and they're building a college resume so that they could get into wherever they think they need to get into. Or you could focus on whether it's their phones or computers. Back in the day, Deb and I would talk to families about don't have a TV in the room, like those days are gone, right? So whether they're on Snapchat all night, and whether they're just not, having consistent bedtimes, all the things that all this goes under this umbrella that we talk about called sleep hygiene. And they're all real. And no one, as we focus on it being important for sleep, as a community, as a society, as a kind of school system, the idea should be educating people on why sleep is important, and that we should be doing all of these things, kind of getting the right sleep hygiene to go to sleep at a reasonable amount of time.
And modeling it for our kids, because
Yes.
for all of this discussion of social media. In some ways, parents are even worse than kids. And we do have to think about that.
100%. So not taking any of that off the table, but the concept is that when we talked about teens being different, and if there's going to be one science thing to remember from this that is specific to teens, is this point right here, that there is a biological shift in these circadian rhythms. That is what helps you figure out when you go to sleep and when you want to wake up. That happens as you're hitting the teen years. Whether it's 12 or 13, it's happening kind of timed to puberty. And it's ending kind of at the end of puberty, but we're really like 21 or so. So there is this shift from the young kids who are infants, toddlers, school age kids, as they move towards adolescent, their bodies physiologically shift when they go to sleep. And so that even if you do everything right in the first portion of the slide, all the sleep hygiene stuff, you cannot get your kid to sleep typically at 9 p.m. if they're a teenager. I get it. Maybe there's a unicorn out there, but in general, the kids cannot go to sleep much before 10:30 or 11. They just can't fall asleep. And it's like asking an adult who's exhausted to go to sleep at 7. You might say you want to go to sleep when you come home, but it's hard to fall asleep 2 hours earlier than your body is expecting to fall asleep. Yet they're waking up early only because we tell them to, right? And we'll talk about what that means, but that is where they are having this getting inadequate sleep, right? So they're getting forced to get up earlier than their body wants them to get up.
And often when I discuss this with parents, there's 2 points I make. One is most parents today do remember growing up without cell phones. In the future, that won't happen as much, but they remember, and I remember staying up late without having a TV in the bedroom or anything else, just that we couldn't fall asleep. We were up, we were doing stuff. Our minds were going, our bodies are going. And that's what happens with kids. Now, the cell phones do make it worse, but they are not the reason it's happening. So the other thing that I do like to talk about, and we'll go into this a little more, is that the kid who used to go to sleep at 8, suddenly 10 o'clock, they're going to sleep. And I remember it distinctly with one of my kids. And parents will tell you, they see it in their own children. So right when that shift happens, guess what happens with school? Boom, earlier. And there's the squeeze. And it's like, to me, a very visual thing when I think about it. We are cutting off their sleep time.
Yeah, and we'll show you how bad that is. So what's happening? So melatonin, it's a hormone release from the brain. It is what kind of initiates and maintains sleep, and it is physiologic. So this is not something that is a New Jersey problem. It is not an iPhone problem. It is not a US problem. It has been the way, kind of to Deb's point, forever. So we see it in all mammals. We think it might have something to do with reproduction cycles and breeding, since it does seem to be a puberty-based shift. And we see it in all, kind of across all continents and across all cultures. And so that this delay in the melatonin secretion starts around puberty. It's this 10:30 or 11 that the kids start to get tired. That melatonin secretion continues well past sunrise. So as you're waking your kids up at 6 a.m. or 6:30, their body is physiologically trying to keep them sleeping. And then again, it normalizes when they're in their 20s. So for the parents who say, I get up early, they should be getting up early, you are physiologically different. And that results in a 2 to 3 hour shift in our teenagers from where they kind of were to where and where they'll be as an adult. So you have to think of them differently. And just focusing on sleep, just to give you a little bit more education, there's a few stages of sleep. You know this, you kind of, stage 1, you're falling asleep, you go to stage 2, then 3, and then you go to REM sleep. And it's this REM sleep where your brain is really active and doing all of this kind of encoding into memory. And just to focus that not all sleep is equal. This slide's a little busy, but if you look, I put that arrow there where you can see the black boxes. That is the REM sleep. And what happens is REM sleep really increases towards the end of the night. So you're getting the majority of your sleep. I'm not sure if you could see my pointer. You're getting the majority of your REM sleep kind of 5 to 8 hours. So when you're waking up at 5 hours, you're missing all of that restorative sleep. And so it's not just the quantity, it is the right type of sleep. And that is what we're, not
Right.
just another thing that we're shortchanging.
And that's where your memories get encoded.
Yep.
It does happen in later sleep. And there are a bunch of super cool studies that can teach about that if you want to look at them. But my favorite story about that is that movie Inside Out that came out like 10 years ago. The girl with all the little creatures in her head and the red guy who was anger is the one everybody remembers. But for those of you who saw it, they actually consulted a lot of neuroscientists about that. And it's all about how her memories got encoded in her brain and when she's sleeping. So it's a great movie.
And here's just a picture. This is the physiological shift that these arrows are what happens during adolescence. You know, you get this kind of shift in your phase. So when you're trying to tell them to go to sleep here, they can't until here. So this is the 10:30. And when you're waking them up here, when your body's waking up and you're okay, they're not ready to wake up yet. And that is why you have such a hard time. And trying to get them to kind of learn in this period of time is bad enough. But this kind of sets them off for the rest of the day. So this is not just our bully pulpit. We have been talking about this for a while, but we're doing this based on the shoulders of, all these other organizations who have made their policy statements based on research. So you could just see it here, the list of places, and whether it's the National Education Association, who says we should be who are endorsing later school start times, the American Academy of Pediatrics. I think this really kicked it off for Deb and I. This is the 2014 policy. The National Association of School Nurses, CDC, the American Medical Association, the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, the National Sleep Foundation, US Surgeon General. So again, this is kind of easy science for everyone to jump on board because the science is really robust. And just to review, like we'll show you some studies. We won't go through them. Just want to hit the highlights. One is there are tons of studies that answer this question. If we delay school start times, will we actually see the benefits of this? And the answer is yes. So we have data going back from the 90s, but really in the last decade, we've seen lots of places. California just instituted this as a state, but we have lots of cities, towns that have done this and then have studied it. And we actually see the benefits. So we see the benefits of improved grades, feeling of well-being, decreased tardiness, accidents. Then we get to the next step, which is if we move school later, won't they just stay up later? And the answer is not significantly. So what we've seen is that every time we have delayed school start times, we actually realize that benefit in terms of increased sleep. So again, not only are the kids more aligned with waking up at the point where their body is ready to wake up. And you guys know what that feels like to wake up when your body's ready and when you wake up and your body's not ready. But they actually get more quantity of sleep. And the better you do about education, about the importance of this, the more benefit you realize. And then as Deb was saying before, the studies actually show families are more satisfied, kids are more satisfied, and teachers feel better, both in their education and when they get to sleep in a little bit more and get to work at a more reasonable time. And this is also not a public health, unfortunately with COVID, sometimes seems to get a little political. This is a bipartisan issue. So Pennsylvania had a bipartisan kind of joint state government commission that did this in 2019. They looked at all the evidence, and as a body, they came out and they said, you're right, the benefits of later school start times are there, and that people should be making decisions based on this. So let's look at some of the topics we talked about. Are mental health issues impacted by sleep? This came out within the last year, just to highlight what we're talking about the mental health crisis. Just so you could see, there's about a 50% increase in emergency room visits for suspected suicide attempts among girls aged 12 to 17. So just to highlight what Deb and I are seeing in our office. Here's a study and let me just move this out of the way so I could see on suicidal behavior. And going back, daytime sleepiness appears to be a significant predictor of suicidal behavior. Here's one on adolescent sleep and depression, coming to the same conclusion that decreased sleep increases the risk of adolescent depression. And just as you're looking at this, I just want to highlight this and let me just, can you guys see this panel? I want to make sure you're not. Here we go.
It all looks good on my end, Bert.
Okay, good. Yeah.
No panel.
So coming back, I just want to highlight the dates of these studies. We are not cherry picking old studies. So these studies are 2019. This one is again 2019. Here's the one we were referring to. This is June of 2019, looking at sleep trajectories with a risky sexual behavior. And so this highlighted, in summary, our findings add to the growing literature suggesting a potential role of sleep disturbances in adolescent risk-taking behaviors, in this case, sexual risk-taking. And the authors even went on to say that one of the strategies is improving sleep by delaying school start times.
A lot of these studies look at 8 hours versus less. I'm going to give you one statistic to hold on to. Kids who get less than 6 hours sleep versus 8 hours are 3 times more likely to consider suicide. 3 times more likely. Now, how many kids are getting less than 6 hours sleep? In 8th grade, it's 20%. In 10th grade, roughly 40%. And by 12th grade, it's 56%. So over half of 12th graders in this country get less than 6 hours sleep in one survey of kids. And of those, imagine that those kids are so much more likely to have suicidal thoughts and potentially to act on those thoughts.
Yeah, and on average, when we're looking, every time we're looking at schools and they've done that, like within New Jersey, they're really looking at 6 and 6 1/4 as like the median sleep, that kids are getting. And so, we have kids are not getting close to the 8 hours that Deb is talking about. Here's a study that came out last year, and this was looking at adolescent substance use, very apropos in New Jersey, as we've now kind of legalized marijuana for 21 and older, which is likely going to increase the ability of teens who already had a decent ability to get marijuana. But there is an increase in both alcohol misuse and substance misuse, including cannabis, for kids who sleep less. And then the physical health issues, this is what I was referring to earlier. So there's a great TED Talk if you want to like scare yourself into sleeping more. Highlighting the fact that lack of sleep is carcinogenic. But what they looked at is the hour. So when you fast forward and you kind of, so you leap ahead in the spring and you fall back in the fall, early winter, does that hour make a difference? Well, when you look at ER data, there was a 24% increase in heart attacks in the 24 hours after daylight savings when you lost an hour of sleep, and the absolute reverse, a 21% decrease in heart attacks showing up into ERs in the 24 hours after daylight savings when everyone got an extra hour of sleep. So the question of does an hour really make a difference, I think is an easy one. And then just some of the studies highlighting the education. So this is one of the multi-night sleep restriction ones. This is a 5 versus 9 hour. And of course, you saw better retention. And this, sometimes I think it's intuitive to think that this will help everyone, but just in case people are concerned about an equity issue, and can you improve the achievement gap? This one is looking at slightly younger kids, so kind of preteen kids. And when we looked at it, just the amount of sleep they were getting, if you look down here, so sleep was less than 8 hours, but predictors for less sleep, Black versus white children, lower versus higher income families. And so we think that this disproportionately, the lack of sleep disproportionately impacts kind of certain more disadvantaged communities in general. And from an equity perspective, trying to improve that will only improve kind of some of the education gap. And we see that. So here's another study embracing the start school later movement. and as a social justice issue. And this is from North Carolina. It was looking at middle schools, and what they saw were that there were better gains. Everyone gained, but what we typically see, and I think we saw this in Seattle too, we saw bigger gains at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum in terms of academic gains.
And it's not just socioeconomics inequity that this impacts, it's also learning abilities. So kids with IEPs and 504 plans, the kids who have ADHD or learning issues, or even some of the kids with IEPs for psychosocial issues, those are the kids who actually do better when we change start times. It's not evenly distributed. The kids who gain the most are the kids who are lagging the most. And as we think about learning loss, as we think about post-COVID strategies to help our kids, this is really important.
Thank you. That's perfect. And then let's focus, on athletics. So that's important to many of us, and a lot of times this gets brought up as a athletics issue where it's difficult to run athletics. But what I would focus on as a priority is, do the student athletes who are participating, is their life better with more sleep? And this is a summary slide of a ton of studies. On the left, what you see is the benefit of sleep on athletic performance, and the right is, you can see the negative aspects of it. And there are studies highlighting everything, for improved shot accuracy in basketball, in faster reaction time. So this really becomes a coordination issue. Improved accuracy in tennis, improved kind of speed, and less mental errors for football. And then on the flip side of that, you have decreased performance but increased injuries across sports. And this is really what we're looking for, right? We want these kids to thrive and not hurt themselves. And this was a New York Times headline from a couple of years ago, and it was highlighting Justin Verlander, who is still an ace pitcher for the Astros. And he was talking about his own saga, and he aims, like it says in the highlight here, 10 hours of sleep a night. But what he was talking to in the article was another pro athlete who was in a slump, who's a hitter, Alex Bregman, and he was saying, you're not sleeping enough. And the story went on to say he increased the amount of sleep, and then he went on to hit over 30 home runs that season. And this is at the level of a professional athlete. So if it can make, not at all insinuating that if your kids just sleep more, they'll make it to the pros, but even at the pro level, these super gifted athletes, sleep makes a huge difference for them. And so much, just to kind of highlight that, I gave a talk with the New York Jets has a mental health performance expert. She's a PhD, and we gave a talk on sleep and kind of mental health / performance. And they hired her as a professional football team to try to help their athletes get enough sleep, because it actually impacts outcome. And then auto accidents. This is a huge one. And, it's amazing that we've actually been able to see this data, but Virginia did this in Fairfax County. They had one county that changed school start times, one didn't. And there was a statistically significant decreased incidence of automobile accidents. Unfortunately, a lot of the teen automobile accidents end up with significant damage, sometimes leading to mortality. And just because the teens slept more, which I have one driver with a permit and could totally see anything we could do to make that better, improve focus would be good.
Right. And it's not just teens it affects, right? Because who's getting hit? If they drive into a tree, it's the teenager. If they drive into you.
And drowsy driving in general, so drowsy driving itself is equivalent to kind of substance abuse driving. So, and that is what we're taking inexperienced drivers and forcing them to be drowsy, inexperienced drivers. In January of 2021, so California passed a law for enacting school start times that just went into play. There was a summit, and they put together a kind of summary of all the research. This is the article, if anyone is looking. And again, we're going to share this information with you, but it was a great summary slide of all the evidence for why this is so important. So I think we're doing okay, Deb. We'll have to take 10 minutes to kind of wrap up by 1:20, and we'll just touch on now, I think, the obstacles, and then open to questions.
And be aware, we're going to the next talk is really going to tackle how do you implement these things and how do we tackle the obstacles.
Right. And the hope is we're going to be doing this with administrators who have kind of walked the walk, not just talk the talk. And so they'll be able to kind of give you their own experience. But there really is very few obstacles other than what we're kind of talking about here. So the first one becomes a transportation issue. The next is sports, then becomes people's schedules, and then impact on other stakeholders. And sometimes there's kind of childcare issues that are in there. And then there is people don't like change, and change is scary at times. So let's just walk you through what this means. So I think it's difficult to not consider transportation, because transportation, again, was what put us in this in the first place. And so you almost always have to at least think through transportation. There are some districts, like there's some districts that are walking districts in New Jersey, Metuchen being one. They don't have buses. They were easy. They were able to just make a change in school times. But if you are doing busing and you're doing multiple tiers, you have to think through it. So, but there are solutions. So we know that if you cut routes, sometimes that means you have to get more buses or bus drivers, and we understand that there's a bus driver shortage. So we have to think through some of those things. But what have districts done? So the first thing, and this is, you can see at the bottom, we talk about hiring a transportation consultant. Looking at this is a big deal, getting people to focus on your transportation routes and seeing can they be done more efficiently, might show you that there are a lot of opportunities that you didn't think about. So there's ways to kind of tighten routes, shaving off time. So, and districts have done that. Princeton, as an example, repurposed bus drivers for out-of-district routes, and that was a way to decrease the amount of expense coming to the district. Some districts, I think East Brunswick is doing this, found ways to go from 3 tiers to 2 tiers. So there are ways to kind of cut back that make it efficient. And then there's ways to swap. And, there's always this question, do you swap the youngest and the oldest kids? I think that there's sometimes some complications, though physiologically, that makes a lot of sense to me. I think, first of all, I think nobody should be going to school significantly early. So I would love everyone to go to school at 8. I mean, whether you're talking about 7:50, but nobody, middle school, elementary school, high school, nobody should be going to school at 7:20. What a lot of schools seem to have done successfully is when they have high school at 7:20, 7:30, middle school at 8:30, and elementary at after 9, they've been able to swap middle and high school, but push middle school much closer to 8 and try to get middle school right around 8 and high school around 8:30. And again, if you keep the 3 tiers, there's no cost, right? There's some change in there. And so the goal is we would love everyone to be 8:30 and beyond. And districts are different. We want you to have the understanding of the public health implications as you're kind of making these decisions. Focusing on sports, again, this becomes first and foremost a decision about priorities. There's no schools that gave up sports, so that's not a thing. Any school that it's probably now somewhere between 10 to 15% of the schools in New Jersey are high schools are 8:30 or later. None of them have had to give up sports, so that's not a thing. They figure it out. There are things to consider: practice, discrepancies in terms of when the school day ends and how you have games and miss class time. And there are some, solutions that have been easy. So one is efficiency. We waste a lot of time in everything in life. And some of these practices, so Deb and I both are school physicians. Sometimes practices could be 3 or 4 hours. And I would make the argument that's not an efficient use of the coach's time or the student's time. Sometimes they like it, but it's not an efficient use of their time and their day. They could, some districts have said, we're making practices 90 minutes. That's what you have. Be as efficient as you need to. And that has been shown to be just as effective. In terms of running games, people, a lot of times when you're running freshman games, JV and varsity, they'll run them one at a time. And districts have found ways to run them in parallel. You have 2 different basketball courts, you have 2 different soccer fields, you just need another official there. Home games are often not impacted, and away games, the ADs have worked together to accommodate it. And some of this ends with finding other ways in terms of your overall function of school. So a lot of districts are moving to a rotating bell schedule. So you don't have the same last period every day. So if you have to miss a class, you're not always missing, pre-calc or whatever that is. Sometimes they're able to do gym as your last class. Then you, in some schools, have been able to shorten the day. So you start school 50 minutes later, but you end school 35 minutes later because you found 15 minutes of fluff in the day that you were able to kind of cut out. So there's a lot of ways to do this, which is why there's still a lot of home rule here, where people can, districts can make their own decisions. And then there's the teacher-parent schedules, obviously, that you have to take into account, but that really takes just a little forethought and planning. And one of the things that we see is change happens pretty quickly, right? You guys did change when you needed to. March of 2020, everyone went virtual in a heartbeat. So we can do it. We just, taking a little bit of time and educating people about why we're doing it, giving them kind of feedback, taking into consideration what their thoughts are, usually makes things much more successful.
I will say that a lot of the pushback that I've heard in my community comes from one, resistance to change just in general. Why can't they be adults? Why can't they do this? But I am hearing from people who say, well, how can I get them to school when my schedule is so tight? And I don't know that I have to be up early and get out early so I can get the kids to school. I think we need to be prepared to understand that concern and address it. And to me, the most powerful way to discuss this is to say, well, we need to put the kids first and their health first. And that's the priority. This is really a public health issue for our kids. And even in sports, it's a health issue. You want to reduce sports injuries? This is how we're going to do it. And it does help if you keep putting that forward as why we're doing this. The priority is our kids' health, our kids' well-being, which is what we all really do support. And the logistics we will work out. And the change will happen when people decide it's worth the hassle.
Yeah, and I think, we probably should be wrapping up, Deb, and I think that was a great way to kind of end it. And we'll, because this really is about our priorities and as a public health issue. So this is what I think we need to focus on. So what did we learn? We learned that when we were in the pandemic, schools were able to change things quickly. And when it was virtual, because there was not a transportation issue, nobody kept school at 7:20 or 7:30. They all pushed it back. And what we saw was what you had said before, Deb. We saw kids saying, I feel better. My mood is better. Families got along better. And there's evidence for this too. So some of the studies that are already looking at it. So is this worth the effort? For sure, right? There's only a few things that people who care about school can do. So from an education perspective, you could educate students, faculty, parents, families on sleep and mental health education. Schools could do, we're trying to do a better job in the schools about being part of the mental health team, but it really comes down to, can you create better policies as a public health issue? Can we make this better for everyone? And Deb, you just said this, this is about prioritizing our goals, right? There is not one thing about early school start times that are in the kids' best interest, academically, physically, from a mental health perspective, athletically. There's a lot of operational issues, but in no way, shape, or form should we ever equate the two as equal. Like, they're real that we have to deal with, but the priority is we should be doing things for their health and finding ways to make it work. And this is this is your school, right? This is your town.
Yes, this is Ridgewood High School, and these are all over the place. You should check your high school for their Instagram account of sleeping students. And it's one way that the kids can address what's happening with the sense of humor.
Yeah, honestly, I think there's one for every town. And so my town has it too. And changing school start times. So people are starting to do this. Just to show you, Milburn, there's me talking at Chatham. Chatham is doing it. And we mentioned before California, so they legislated this. They were the first state to do it. Their legislation is 8:30 for high schools, 8 o'clock for middle school. Currently, so we've been trying to do this on a local level. It is hard for anyone who's been involved with local kind of boards. It is hard to kind of get everyone, teach them the science, have them make the change. And then because there are a lot of other obstacles, not many towns, some towns have been successful, but it takes champions and it's difficult. So with that, Speaker Coughlin and Senator Gopal have proposed legislation. So that is kind of in New Jersey, currently in the works. It has not yet actually been presented. So this is just really early in the process. But they have the right thoughts, and we are very proud of them for doing this. And we're very hopeful that this will continue to progress forward. And, you know, this is an article, Governor Murphy saying he's open to it. So what could we do? We could try to help them. So implementing later high school start times is just a huge policy change that will, every kid, our district has 1,600 kids. Actually, one of my schools, 1,600, one of the schools, 2,000. I mean, it is hard to have policies that will positively impact so many kids immediately. I can't think of anything other than this. And knowing this information and not doing something with it is really an issue. Right? You know, it is really continuing to do harm to our kids. And this is, you know, from Senator Portantino. And if you focus on the kind of middle, it's time for an evidence-based sound policy discussion that prioritizes student health. Teaching adolescents at a time they can't effectively learn, it's an ineffective use of public funds and undermines our children's health and their chance for success today and in the future. And this is who we are. And so this is Deb and I. Our email addresses are here. Send us love letters. Please don't send us hate mail. Marcella, who you heard, and Brittany, who are on it, have been kind of not just instrumental, but we could not be doing any of this without them. So this is a kind of pilot of love for them. And so we're really thankful to have their support. And this is our goal, is taking a small group of us and hoping we could, you know, try to change the world, you know, one kid's sleep at a time. All right, so let's end here and stay tuned for part 2.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Spangelbaum and Steinbaum. Once again, if you have any questions, please type them into the question box. You should see that at the bottom or top of your screen. And also after the webinar, if you have additional questions you didn't think of, you can feel free to email us at MHC, which stands for Mental Health Collaborative. So it's MHC@njaap.org. And we can share those questions with our 2 presenters and get back to you with some answers. At this time, I do see a question that's popped up regarding napping. Does napping during the day after school have a positive or negative effect on the children?
That's a tricky one. Naps can be really refreshing and helpful for kids. However, if they're too long or they're at the wrong time of day, it can be tough. So there's kind of a movement for power naps, which would be like a 15-minute to a half-hour nap. But there's a lot of difficulty kind of making sure a kid who's completely exhausted would take a nap that's short enough to remain useful yet not take over the day. It's really tough.
Yeah.
I would talk with a sleep expert about it more, but
So I totally agree with you, Deb. But I think from a practical perspective, when I hear these questions, what I hear people saying is, all right, my kid is getting 7 hours a day because they're sleeping 5 hours at night and 2 hours in the afternoon. And what I would focus on is a few things. It's not just the quantity of sleep. So one of the reasons that I like to include the slide about the kind of REM sleep, remembering like not all sleep is equal. So that REM sleep is happening in the later half of the kind of sleep cycle, that 5 to 8 hours. In napping, you're not really getting that REM sleep. And so besides the fact that you are waking up and you're not in the right sleep cycle, your melatonin is still keeping your body awake. So you just don't feel all day long like those days that you feel like I just got up on the wrong side of the bed. That's how the adolescents typically feel. The napping doesn't do anything to make that better and does potentiate this, making it even more difficult to fall asleep at a more reasonable time. So in a perfect world, the kids, it's totally fine to take a 15 to 20-minute power nap that might make them temporarily feel a little bit better and not impact them going to sleep, but it doesn't do anything for all the health consequences of sleep. For that, you need to actually get real sleep at nighttime.
and I do think that the more we learn about sleep, the more we're going to realize that this may be doing more permanent damage than we realize. That's something that Judith Owens of Boston at Harvard was saying, that we are right now consigning this entire generation to sleep deprivation in this formative period of their childhoods. And it's a massive experiment that I don't really approve of for our kids. It's not good policy, it's not good science, it's not good healthcare, and we have the power to change it.
Yeah, and that is why I think you see us here taking the time to try to educate and bring out the message. We're passionate enough about this because the science is so overwhelming, and the concept of saying, hey, we get it, we should totally do this 10 years from now, is taking, however many students there are in New Jersey, the US, or, and looking at the long-term implications of all of these negative consequences when we know we could fix it. We know that if we just take the time, we could implement something that will make it better, and we could do it really quickly. So our hope is to convince you that sleep is super important for your own health and your kids' health, or the kids that you're kind of in charge of if you're an administrator, and to recognize that there is a public health kind of crisis and that you can help solve it. That's what we're hoping from today.
And it can be done quickly. Ames, Iowa, the whole city just changed. They voted in April, and they're moving forward now. Their new school year, healthy hours. And there's a number of people, this kind of goes right into our next talk. There's a number of people out there who've done this, who really are happy to share with everyone their experiences, the good, the bad, the ugly, and what made a difference for them in planning this and implementing it.
That's a great point. This is Marcella again. I know I'm from East Brunswick, and East Brunswick just voted on this with the board in the spring, as late as May, and they were able to implement this for this fall. It was a change from 7:25 to 8 o'clock for the high school and for the junior high as well. So it definitely can be done in a quick time frame if you have, if you talk to all the people that need to be involved, in terms of contracts and transportation. Chatham as well. Chatham was able to do this pretty quickly, I think, voting on this in the board in March and doing that for this fall.
Yep. Well, thank you, everyone. Marcella, I think we finished on time, and I think Deb and I did such a nice job that there were so few questions. Hopefully it'll be, more, the questions will likely be more operational for the next one we do, and that'll be more of a discussion. So thank you for everyone.
Absolutely.
Thanks, everyone.
We really appreciate it.
And please
Yeah.
follow up if you have questions. We're here.
Yeah, thank you both again so much. I just want to close by saying on behalf of the NJAP, I want to thank you for joining us today for our webinar. And please be aware that we will have this posted on our website sometime in the next week, so you can watch it again or share it with as a link with your colleagues, your peers. Please be on the lookout again, as we mentioned, for part 2. We don't have a date set yet, but it's going to be likely late September, and we're still talking with a few presenters, principals, and superintendents of various districts that have made this change, so we can have them join our panel and discuss how they did that. And again, feel free to email any one of us with any remaining questions you may think of after today's webinar. You can reach us again at mhc@njap.org, and we'll be sharing a follow-up email later today or tomorrow with some links and additional resources. And with that, thank you so much again, and this concludes our webinar.
Thank you, Marcella, and Deb, thank you for co-running this with me. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Bert.
Bye, everyone.
Bye,
Bye.
take care.